Lord Peter Wimsey held the cushion aloft for a moment longer, allowing the pale November light from the morning-room windows to catch its surface at varying angles. The geometric pattern seemed to shift subtly in the changing luminescence, a trick of the eye, perhaps, or evidence of uneven wear. He turned it once more, methodically, as though subjecting it to silent interrogation before setting it upon the settle, with the care one might display when handling an unexploded device. Margaret Ashford watched him with the intensity of a woman who had spent the preceding 72 hours rehearsing this very moment in her mind, perfecting each inflection and gesture until the truth of her suspicion had calcified into something bearing the weight of testimony. Wimsey lit another cigarette, a deliberate act, calculated to fill the pause with the small ritual of flame and tobacco, and said nothing. This silence stretched between them like a thread drawn taut, and when finally he spoke, it was not to answer his own question, but rather to pose another, which was very much his way. "Your husband," he began, seating himself opposite her with the casual grace of a man entirely accustomed to inserting himself into domestic crises, "was a creature of habit, you have indicated. 4:30, the morning room, this particular settle, that particular cushion. A man of 68, sound in wind and limb despite his indifference to exercise, accustomed to his routines as other men are accustomed to their skins. And yet someone, we must presume, was sufficiently acquainted with these habits to exploit them. The question is not so much whether your suspicion is warranted, Mrs. Ashford, but rather whether you are equal to the considerable unpleasantness required to prove it. For if I am reading this situation with anything approaching accuracy, and my reading of situations is generally rather precise, we are not discussing a crime of passion or opportunity, but rather one of meticulous planning, rather cold planning indeed. Margaret's fingers tightened upon the arm of her chair, but her voice remained steady. "I am quite equal to unpleasantness, Lord Peter. I have been equal to unpleasantness for 23 years of marriage to Charles. This matter, whatever it may involve, cannot exceed the daily unpleasantness of existing as his wife." Wimsey smiled, a fleeting expression that suggested he had just appreciated a particularly clever phrase in a 17th-century poem. "Then we must begin with your valet, Hastings, I presume, and the precise sequence of events on Saturday afternoon. Not the official account, you understand, but rather the manner in which he has described it to you subsequently, when the inspector was not present to guide his narrative into more comfortable channels. What followed was a conversation of considerable intricacy, conducted with Wimsey's characteristic method of appearing to discuss one matter, whilst accumulating information regarding entirely separate ones. He inquired about Charles's digestion, his correspondence, his recent business affairs. He asked whether Margaret had noticed any new servants recently engaged, whether any recent repairs or maintenance had been conducted upon the morning room, and whether her husband had made any alterations to his will in the preceding months. She answered each question with the precision of someone accustomed to addressing questions posed by solicitors and tax collectors, and with each answer Wimsey's expression grew minutely more thoughtful, until by the time Margaret had concluded her account, he possessed a remarkably thorough understanding of the households, rhythms, and personnel. "And this valet, Hastings," Wimsey said finally, "has been with your husband for how long? 14 years since Charles's first marriage ended. A loyal retainer, then. The sort of servant who becomes indispensable to a household, who understands not merely what his employer requires, but why he requires it. The sort of fellow who might know, for instance, that a particular cushion, positioned precisely thus, would be the ideal repository for, well, for whatever was meant to be reposed there." Wimsey rose abruptly and walked to the window, from which one could observe the Ashford gardens in their November desolation, bare branches, greying lawns, and a small stone bench that appeared to be weeping. "I wonder whether Hastings has mentioned to you that he was formerly employed by your husband's brother before that brother's own rather untimely death 5 years ago. I wonder whether you have, in fact, made the connection at all." Margaret's face underwent a subtle transformation, not shock precisely, but rather the recalibration of features that occurs when one's worst suspicions have been confirmed by an external intelligence. I did not know he had been employed by. Charles never mentioned. No, Wimsey agreed. Charles would not have mentioned it. Your husband was a man of ordered mind and deliberate forgetfulness. Inconvenient details were filed away with the same precision he applied to his business affairs, which is to say they were filed away very thoroughly indeed, until no one required to think of them at all. He turned from the window to face her directly. I shall require a private conversation with Mr. Hastings, and I shall require to examine your husband's study, not officially, you understand, but rather as a gentleman acquiring certain documents on behalf of a widow managing her late husband's affairs. After which, I suspect, we shall require to discuss the matter of your husband's brother with considerably greater attention than has yet been devoted to it. But first, Mrs. Ashford, I must ask you a question of considerable delicacy. When your husband was discovered on Sunday evening, was he wearing his usual attire, or had he changed for dinner? Margaret Ashford's response came after a pause so prolonged that one might have mistaken it for refusal to answer. She rose from her chair and walked to a side table upon which lay a small leather-bound album, the sort of thing that widows compile in the aftermath of loss, a chronicle of moments one might otherwise forget, or, conversely, might prefer to forget entirely. She opened it to a photograph dated the previous Saturday and handed it to Wimsey without commentary. The image showed Charles Ashford positioned upon the very settle they had been discussing, dressed in his afternoon attire of grey wool and waistcoat, the fatal cushion arranged precisely as Margaret had demonstrated. But what was significant? What elevated this from mere domestic documentation to evidence of considerable importance was that Charles wore, around his neck, a peculiar silk scarf of an unusual shade of violet, the sort of garment one might associate with either artistic pretension or deliberate concealment. Wimsey studied the photograph with the intensity of a man reading the final pages of an elaborate manuscript, and when he finally looked up, his expression had acquired that particular quality. It assumed when the logical architecture of a crime had begun to reveal itself in all its calculated precision. "This scarf," he said quietly. "I take it he was not wearing it when discovered?" "He was not wearing it at all," Margaret confirmed. "When the doctor examined him, there was nothing about his neck save his collar and shirt. I have searched the morning room exhaustively, as well as the study and his dressing room. The scarf has vanished entirely." Wimsey returned to his seat and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a posture of concentration he adopted when engaged in particularly demanding mental labor. "Your husband's brother, the one who died 5 years ago, what was the precise nature of his demise? Do not," he added swiftly, anticipating her response, "rely upon the official account. Consult instead your recollection of what Charles said, or more significantly, what he did not say. The silences in a man's speech are often more eloquent than his words." Margaret settled herself once more, and when she spoke, her voice had acquired a new quality, that of someone unburdening themselves of information long withheld, perhaps from a sense of delicacy, perhaps from a fear of seeming melodramatic. "Edward was Charles's older brother," she began. "He lived abroad, Cairo primarily, where he had various business interests in textile importing. He was considered something of an adventurer by the family, though Charles always referred to him as unnecessarily theatrical. 5 years ago, Edward died in Cairo under circumstances that were never entirely clear. Officially, he fell from a hotel balcony whilst in an altered state. The Cairo authorities were not particularly thorough in their investigations, as one might expect. Charles received notification through his solicitors, inherited a considerable sum. Edward had no children or surviving spouse, and never mentioned his brother again. Completely, utterly erased him from conversation. And yet, Wimsey observed, he retained Hastings, who had served Edward previously. A curious decision for a man of your husband's calculated nature, unless, of course, Hastings possessed information of sufficient delicacy to ensure his continued employment, or unless Charles harbored certain suspicions regarding Edward's death that required Hastings' presence as a form of, what shall we call it, insurance? The implication hung in the morning room air like smoke that refused to disperse. Margaret's face had paled to a shade that matched the linen of the still cushion, and her fingers, when she reached for the photograph once more, trembled slightly. "You are suggesting," she said slowly, "that Charles was somehow responsible for Edward's death?" "I am suggesting nothing," Whimsy corrected gently. "I am merely observing that your husband inherited a considerable fortune upon his brother's demise under suspicious circumstances, that he subsequently retained the deceased brother's personal valet, that he appears to have worn an unusual and concealing garment for what was ostensibly an ordinary afternoon in the morning room, and that said garment has vanished entirely following his own death. I am further observing that someone was sufficiently familiar with your husband's habits to place what I suspect was a rather ingenious delivery mechanism within his favorite cushion, and that someone had cause to wish him removed from the world with considerable urgency. These are not suggestions, Mrs. Ashford. These are merely observations of fact, arranged in a sequence that begins to resemble not a random tragedy, but rather a very deliberate act of retribution. At that precise moment, as though summoned by the mere articulation of these theories, there came a knock upon the morning-room door. Hastings entered, a man of perhaps 60, with the carefully neutral expression of a senior servant who has witnessed considerable domestic upheaval and chosen to retain his opinions regarding it entirely to himself. He carried a silver salver upon which lay a letter, its envelope bearing the official seal of the Cairo Constabulary. His eyes, when they met Whimsy's, contained something Hat might have been recognition, or might have been fear, or might have been the peculiar combination of both that occurs when a man realizes his carefully constructed present has finally been invaded by the unquiet past. "A telegram has arrived," Hastings said, his voice steady despite the subtle pallor that had invaded his complexion, "from Cairo. It appears that new evidence has come to light regarding the death of Mr. Edward Ashford 5 years ago. The authorities wish to communicate with members of his family regarding certain inconsistencies in the original inquiry." Whimsy accepted the letter with a smile of considerable charm. "How absolutely fascinating," he said. "How very, very timely indeed." Whimsy broke the seal with deliberate care, his movements possessed of that particular languor he affected when circumstances demanded close attention to detail. The contents of the telegram proved to be rather more extensive than the typical wire, suggesting that someone in Cairo had been sufficiently moved by recent developments to abandon brevity in favor of comprehensiveness. He read through the communication twice, his expression remaining carefully neutral before handing it to Margaret, with the observation that she would find it considerably more enlightening than the official account of her brother-in-law's demise had proven to be. The telegram, dated 3 days previous, informed them that a chambermaid at the Cairo hotel had come forward with a deathbed confession. She had witnessed Edward Ashford's fall, not as an accident, but as a deliberate act of violence, perpetrated by 2 men whose description matched no one in the hotel's employ. Furthermore, the Cairo authorities had recently acquired certain correspondence that suggested Edward had been engaged in uncovering a fraud of considerable magnitude, one involving textile shipments that had been systematic, misrepresented and diverted for purposes unknown. The investigation, the telegram concluded, was being reopened, and they would be grateful for any information regarding Mr. Charles Ashford's involvement in or knowledge of his brother's business affairs. Hastings, during this recitation, had not moved. His position remained precisely as it had been when he entered, feet placed at a specific angle, hands at his sides, expression arranged into that mask of professional indifference that senior servants employ when their world is collapsing about them. Whimsy, having absorbed the contents of the telegram with the thoroughness of a man for whom such documents invariably contained multiple layers of significance, turned his attention toward the valet with the concentration one might reserve for a particularly demanding classical text. "Mr. Hastings," he began, his tone suggesting a friendly inquiry rather than anything approaching accusation. "You were in Cairo when Mr. Edward died. You were present at the hotel, were you not? And you returned to England some 3 weeks later, when it became apparent that the circumstances of your employer's death would not receive the scrutiny they perhaps deserved. I wonder whether you might elaborate upon those events, now that the Cairo authorities have seen fit to resurrect them for our collective edification." The valet's composure, which had remained admirably intact until this moment, underwent a subtle but unmistakable fracture. His jaw tightened, and a faint flush invaded the careful pallor of his cheeks. When he spoke, his voice had acquired a quality of barely suppressed emotion, as though 5 years of carefully maintained professional detachment had begun to crumble under the weight of questions posed with such exquisite precision. "I was not," he said slowly, "present at the moment of Mr. Edward's death. I was in the hotel, but I was not in his suite. I'd been dismissed an hour prior, dismissed quite suddenly without explanation by Mr. Charles Ashford himself, who had arrived from England unexpectedly." "Ah," Whimsy said softly, "now we begin to approach something approaching the truth, do we not? Your Mr. Charles arrived in Cairo unannounced, dismissed you from your post, and within a matter of hours his brother was discovered at the bottom of a hotel balcony. I wonder what provoked such urgency. Surely it was not merely familial concern for Edward's welfare. One does not travel the length of Europe in such haste merely to ensure a brother's continued sobriety." Margaret had risen from her chair and was staring at Hastings with an expression of dawning comprehension that suggested pieces of her matrimonial history were abruptly rearranging themselves into a pattern considerably less flattering than she had previously believed. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew what Charles had done. That is why he kept you. That is why you remained in his employ despite every indication that you had been treated shamefully." "I knew," Hastings confirmed, "that Mr. Edward had discovered that Mr. Charles had been systematically embezzling from their shared business interests for nearly a decade. I knew that Mr. Edward intended to expose the fraud publicly, which would have resulted not only in Mr. Charles's prosecution, but in the destruction of the family name. I knew that Mr. Charles had traveled to Cairo with the express purpose of preventing that exposure." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had acquired the quality of a man finally unburdening himself of a confession long suppressed. "What I did not know, what I was not present to witness, was precisely how he managed it. But I knew with absolute certainty that when I left Cairo, it would be with the understanding that my NCE regarding Mr. Charles's arrival and departure would be compensated with a position for life within his household, and that any suggestion otherwise would result in my own involvement being disclosed to the authorities." Whimsy settled back into his chair with the satisfied air of a man whose theoretical constructions had begun to manifest themselves in observable fact. "So your Mr. Charles was not merely a man of habit and ordered mind, but rather a man of considerable ruthlessness when his interests were threatened. A man, moreover, who had successfully concealed a fratricide for 5 years, who had retained the one witness to his presence in Cairo as insurance against future exposure, and who had apparently grown rather paranoid regarding the possibility of his crimes being unearthed. The violet scarf," he added, turning once more to address Margaret directly, "was not worn for aesthetic purposes, was it, Mrs. Ashford? It was worn to conceal. Conceal what, precisely, I do not yet know, but I suspect that if we were to examine your husband's neck, if the authorities were to permit such examination, we would discover marks of considerable vintage, marks that would not match the present week, but rather would correspond with events occurring some 5 years prior, during a rather precipitous fall in Cairo. The silence that followed Whimsy's pronouncement was of the particular variety that descends upon rooms when certain boundaries of civilized discourse have been irrevocably crossed. Margaret had seated herself once more, her hands folded with the precision of someone engaged in elaborate internal warfare, her expression suggesting that the comfortable fiction of widowhood had been rather thoroughly demolished and replaced with something considerably more troubling. Hastings remained motionless, and it was this very immobility that spoke volumes regarding the accuracy of Whimsy's deductions. The valet's silence was not the silence of innocence or confusion, but rather the silence of a man watching his carefully constructed edifice of complicity finally collapse beneath its own accumulated weight. Whimsy, observing these reactions with the satisfaction of one who has orchestrated a particularly successful piece of social choreography, rose and walked once more to the window, where the November garden offered nothing but bare branches and gathering dusk. When he turned back, his expression had assumed that particular quality of sympathetic detachment it acquired when he was about to ask questions whose answers would cause considerable discomfort to those obliged to provide them. "The matter now becomes considerably more intricate," he observed, "because we are no longer discussing a single crime, but rather two, or possibly three, depending upon how one categorizes certain acts of long-delayed vengeance. Your husband, Mrs. Ashford, did not merely kill his brother in Cairo. That would have been quite straightforward, albeit criminal. No, your husband apparently spent 5 years in a state of increasingly elaborate paranoia, convinced that at any moment his crime would be discovered and his position destroyed. He retained Hastings not from affection but from terror. He maintained meticulous control over every aspect of his life, as though careful observation of routine might somehow prevent the past from manifesting itself in his present. And then, approximately 3 days ago, someone informed him that the Cairo authorities had reopened their investigation. Someone ensured that he received this information in a manner that would drive him not to confess or flee, but to panic with considerable thoroughness. He paused, allowing this observation to settle into the consciousness of those present. The question that now presents itself is not who killed your husband, Mrs. Ashford, but rather who possessed both the motive and the intimate knowledge of his habits necessary to construct what we must presume was an extremely sophisticated mechanism. The cushion, you see, could not have been filled with anything so crude as poison. The scent was chemical, yes, but it was also ephemeral, suggesting something that would volatilize upon contact with body heat, something that would produce a sensation of extreme physical distress, perhaps, but nothing so obvious as to invite immediate medical scrutiny. And yet it produced a heart attack in a man who, by all accounts, possessed a reasonably sound cardiac system. Which suggests to me that what was placed within that cushion was something considerably more refined than common toxins. Hastings cleared his throat, a sound that suggested he had reached some internal decision regarding the limits of his silence. "If I may venture an observation," he said carefully, "Mr. Edward possessed considerable knowledge of certain pharmaceutical compounds. He had, prior to his business career, studied chemistry at Cambridge. During his time in Cairo, he maintained certain professional acquaintances who possessed access to rather specialized materials. I do not know," he added hastily, "what was placed within the cushion. I merely observe that Mr. Edward's scientific knowledge was considerably broader than most men's." Wimsey smiled with genuine appreciation. "Ah, now we approach something approaching the truth with considerably greater clarity. Mr. Edward, despite being deceased these 5 years, has apparently reached backward from beyond the grave to exact a rather elaborate revenge upon the brother who murdered him. A revenge that required not merely the acquisition of a lethal substance, but also the placement of that substance within the very heart of the Ashford household. By someone possessed of intimate knowledge of the household's arrangements and the master's habits. Someone, in fact, who had access to this very morning room at will. Someone whose presence would provoke no comment, no suspicion, no disruption to routine. At this juncture, there came another knock upon the morning room door, this time more peremptory than before. Inspector Cranston entered, his expression suggesting that he had been occupied with matters of considerable bureaucratic complexity and had arrived at Ashford Manor considerably exasperated by the necessity of doing so. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the careful demeanor of someone who had spent considerable time learning to navigate the peculiar intersection of law enforcement and aristocratic privilege. Behind him stood a younger constable bearing what appeared to be a small leather journal and several photographic plates. "Lord Peter," Cranston began, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely surprised to find Wimsey present. "I trust you have not been contaminating evidence or disrupting the witnesses beyond your usual considerable standards of disruption. We have, it appears, acquired certain additional documentation from Cairo that may prove illuminating regarding the circumstances of Mr. Charles Ashford's demise. Particularly," he added, withdrawing a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket, "a letter that was apparently posted 3 weeks ago with instructions that it remain sealed until such time as the Cairo investigation into Edward Ashford's death was reopened." which, as you may be aware, occurred precisely 72 hours prior to Charles Ashford's own rather unexpected death. Whimsy accepted the envelope with the care of a man handling an artifact of considerable historical significance. The handwriting upon it was precise, controlled, and utterly unmistakable, for it matched, almost precisely, the signature that appeared upon several of Charles's own financial documents that Whimsy had glimpsed during his examination of the household's arrangements. "I wonder," he said softly, "whether you might provide us with the considerable pleasure of learning what your Mr. Edward possessed sufficient foresight to commit to paper some 5 years ago, knowing that his words might require several seasons to reach their intended audience." Inspector Cranston produced a second envelope from his waistcoat pocket, this one bearing the official seals of the Cairo Constabulary and several customs notations, suggesting it had traversed considerable geographical distance before arriving at its present location. He opened it with methodical care and extracted a letter composed upon cream-colored paper in the precise handwriting that matched the exterior envelope. The document was not lengthy, but it possessed the quality of utterances that have been composed with extreme deliberation, each phrase selected with meticulous attention to its eventual impact upon those who would ultimately read it. Cranston adjusted his spectacles and began to read aloud, his voice acquiring that particular cadence one adopts when delivering testimony of considerable import in a formal setting. Though the morning room of Ashford Manor was decidedly informal and the circumstances decidedly unprecedented, "To whom it may concern," Cranston read, "and particularly to Inspector Cranston of Scotland Yard, should this letter reach such hands. I am Edward Ashford, currently residing in Cairo, Egypt, and I write this document with the full knowledge that I am unlikely to survive the week in which it is composed. My brother, Charles Ashford, has arrived in Cairo with the express intention of preventing me from exposing a fraud that has enriched him considerably at the expense of our mutual bus. Ines, interests. I am not naive regarding my prospects. I have therefore arranged that this letter be posted to Cairo's constabulary only in the event that my death occurs under suspicious circumstances and is subsequently investigated by British authorities. Should you be reading this, it means that investigation has begun. The truth is as follows: Charles has been systematically embezzling funds for nearly a decade. Upon my discovery of this embezzlement, I informed him of my intention to prosecute the matter through both civil and criminal channels. He responded to this announcement by arriving at my hotel unannounced and, through means I need not specify, ensured that I would never testify regarding these facts. I am writing this letter with the knowledge that I will not survive to see justice enacted, but with the hope that this document may serve as catalyst for investigation into crimes that extend considerably beyond the mere matter of my own demise." The inspector paused, allowing the weight of Edward's words to settle upon his assembled audience. Margaret had gone quite still, her face assuming that peculiar pallor one observes in individuals confronting truths that fundamentally alter their understanding of their own existence. Hastings, by contrast, appeared almost relieved, as though the articulation of facts long suppressed had lifted from him some burden he had carried in solitude for half a decade. "There is more," Cranston continued, "but it concerns primarily financial documentation and the names of certain individuals in Cairo who could corroborate Edward's allegations regarding the embezzlement. However," he added, "what proves particularly relevant to the matter of Charles Ashford's death is the final paragraph, which reads as follows: Should Charles escape prosecution for my death, I have arranged for a certain contingency. A colleague of mine, A, man of considerable chemical expertise, has been instructed to prepare a substance that will produce cardiac failure in any individual exposed to it, provided that individual possesses certain predispositions toward cardiac irregularity. Charles has exhibited such predispositions. This substance has been entrusted to a reliable individual with specific instructions regarding its deployment should Charles prove to escape justice through official channels. I do not advocate vigilantism, but I do insist upon justice, whether administered through law or through necessity. If this letter is being read, it is because my murder has been established, and Charles has presumably escaped prosecution through some combination of corruption and geographical distance. In that event, The contingency will be activated." Whimsy had closed his eyes during the reading of this final passage, and when he opened them again, his expression suggested that the architecture of the crime had revealed itself in all its terrible and elegant complexity. He turned to Hastings with a question posed with the precision of a surgeon making a crucial incision. "Tell me, Mr. Hastings," he said softly, "did Mr. Edward, prior to his death, provide you with certain instructions regarding particular contingencies? Instructions that were to be activated only in the event that he died under suspicious circumstances, and Charles escaped prosecution?" The valet's response came slowly, as though he were extracting each word from depths of conscience that had been sealed away for 5 years. "Mr. Edward was a man of considerable foresight and equally considerable vindictiveness when wronged," he said finally. "He took me into his confidence approximately 1 week before his death. He had anticipated, you see, that his brother's visit would prove fatal. He had provided me with certain materials, compounds prepared by an Egyptian chemist of his acquaintance, with explicit instructions that they be held in safekeeping and deployed only in the event that Charles Ashford escaped prosecution for Edward's murder. I was to ensure that the substance was introduced into something Charles would ingest or be exposed to regularly, something he could not avoid, something that would produce cardiac failure within a reasonable time frame." "And the cushion?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "The cushion," Hastings confirmed, "was replaced approximately 1 month ago, Mrs. Ashford. I obtained a replica from the original manufacturer and arranged for the new filling to contain the prepared compound. I calculated that it would remain effective for approximately 2 months before volatilizing completely. I had intended, in fact, to replace it again before Christmas as a precautionary measure, but when the telegram arrived from Cairo, indicating that the investigation had been reopened, I realized that Mr. Charles's days were numbered. The irony, of course, is that he was not afraid of prosecution. He was afraid of exposure. The prospect of the world learning what he had done destroyed him far more effectively than any legal proceeding might have managed." Inspector Cranston regarded Hastings with an expression of profound weariness. "Mr. Hastings," he said quietly, "I must inform you that you are under arrest for the murder of Charles Ashford. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you have rather thoroughly exhausted that particular privilege." Whimsy, by contrast, remained perfectly motionless, and when at last he spoke, his voice carried that particular quality of philosophical detachment that suggested he had witnessed something both terrible and profoundly human unfold before him. "Justice," he observed quietly to no one in particular, "is a peculiar thing. It is rarely administered by those we might expect to administer it, and it frequently arrives far too late to provide any comfort to those who have suffered its absence." The constable who had accompanied Inspector Cranston proceeded to place restraints upon Hastings with the practiced efficiency of one accustomed to such melancholy duties, and the valet submitted to this process without resistance or protestation. As he was led from the morning room, he paused momentarily at the threshold, and when he turned back to address those assembled, his expression had acquired a quality of almost serene resignation, as though the burden of 5 years' concealment had finally lifted sufficiently to permit him something approaching peace. "Mr. Edward was a good man," he said quietly. "Flawed, certainly, and inclined toward vindictiveness, but fundamentally good. He did not deserve what Charles did to him. I do not regret what I have done, though I accept that the law will require me to pay for it. Justice delayed is not justice denied, Lord Peter. It is merely justice transformed into something considerably less palatable than it might have been." With that, he was escorted from the room, leaving behind a silence considerably more profound than any that had previously occupied that space. Inspector Cranston, once the valet had been removed, settled himself into a chair with the air of a man who has witnessed the resolution of a case and now must engage in the considerable tedium of documentation and official procedure. He withdrew a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket and began to make certain notations, his expression suggesting that, while he understood the moral complexities of the situation, his professional obligations remained considerably more straightforward. "The Cairo authorities," he observed without looking up from his notes, will undoubtedly be interested in pursuing. Charges regarding Edward Ashford's murder, though I suspect they will prove considerably more reluctant than we might wish to engage in complicated extradition proceedings for a man now deceased. The matter of Charles Ashford's death, however, presents considerably more intricate legal questions. Hastings' actions constitute murder under English law, regardless of the moral considerations that might attend them. Yet the Crown will be obliged to prosecute, and a jury will be obliged to render judgment. I confess I do not envy the barrister charged with presenting this case, nor the jury members who will be required to determine culpability in circumstances so thoroughly saturated with competing claims upon justice. Wimsey had drifted once more to the window, and he stood with his back to the assembled company, observing the November darkness as it descended upon the gardens with the inevitability of all natural processes. When at last he spoke, it was to pose a question directed not toward Cranston, but toward Margaret Ashford, who had remained seated throughout the proceedings with the immobility of a woman attempting to comprehend how the comfortable fiction of her matrimonial life had been so thoroughly supplanted by ugliness and deception. "Mrs. Ashford," he began, "you must now confront a peculiar situation entirely of your own making, though I suspect you did not recognize it as such until this present moment. Your husband murdered his brother in circumstances that suggested either accident or suicide. Your husband then spent 5 years in increasingly elaborate paranoia, convinced that discovery was imminent. Your husband, in fact, engineered his own doom through the simple mechanism of his own fear. And now you are left with the curious obligation of determining what you shall do with the knowledge you possess regarding these matters. The official account will be that Hastings murdered your husband, presumably for reasons relating to some grudge or derangement. The truth, however, is considerably more complicated, and you alone possess the authority to determine which version of events shall be presented to those who will judge Hastings' culpability." Margaret rose slowly, as though her joints had become considerably less cooperative with gravity during the course of the afternoon's revelations. She walked to the mantelpiece and regarded the portrait of her late husband, with an expression that suggested she was observing a stranger whose features bore an unfortunate resemblance to someone she had once believed herself to know. "I did not love him," she said quietly. "I have not loved him for years, if indeed I ever did. He was a man of considerable emotional cruelty, disguised beneath layers of propriety and financial acumen. He was a man, moreover, who apparently committed murder to preserve his own comfort and reputation. And yet, I confess, I did not anticipate that the preservation of his secrets would require such elaborate mechanisms of destruction." She turned back to address Wimsey directly. "What do you advise, Lord Peter? Shall I present the full truth to the authorities, or shall I permit Hastings to be prosecuted on the basis of incomplete information?" Wimsey was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally responded, his voice carried that particular quality of philosophical weariness it acquired when circumstances presented moral questions without clear or satisfying answers. "That, Mrs. Ashford, is not a question I am equipped to answer for you. The law would advise prosecution based upon available evidence and testimony. Morality might suggest that justice for Edward requires exposition of his brother's crime, regardless of the consequences for Hastings. But you must consider also that Hastings has already suffered considerably. 5 years of concealment, 5 years of complicity in an act of vigilantism born of genuine grievance. A jury, presented with all the facts, might prove considerably more sympathetic to his circumstances than the law technically permits. Or they might not. That uncertainty is precisely what makes this situation so deeply troubling. We possess the facts of the crime, yet we cannot predict with certainty the consequences of their revelation." Inspector Cranston closed his notebook with deliberate finality. "The Crown will require a statement from you, Mrs. Ashford," he said formally. "You may provide such statement as you see fit, omitting or emphasizing details according to your conscience. I cannot advise you regarding what that conscience dictates, nor would I presume to do so. However, I will observe that the truth, however uncomfortable, generally proves considerably more serviceable than partial truths or convenient fictions. We shall require your statement by tomorrow morning. Until that time, You are free to consider precisely what you wish to communicate regarding these matters. Inspector Cranston and his constable departed Ashford Manor as the November evening settled into complete darkness, taking with them the still cushion in its evidence wrappings, and a preliminary statement from Margaret that proved sufficiently non-committal to avoid any immediate legal complications. Whimsy remained ostensibly to ensure that the widow possessed adequate support during this period of considerable domestic upheaval, though in reality he had developed a curiosity regarding the precise mechanisms by which Edward Ashford had orchestrated his revenge across the considerable distance of both geography and time. He settled himself in the library with a glass of rather excellent claret, one of the few aspects of Charles Ashford's existence that suggested genuine taste, and requested that Margaret join him once she had attended to the various domestic necessities that the arrest of one's household servants necessarily precipitated. When she arrived, some 30 minutes later, she had assumed the appearance of a woman who had subjected herself to considerable internal scrutiny and emerged with certain resolutions firmly established. "I have decided," she announced without preamble, settling herself opposite Whimsy with the deliberation of one announcing a matter of considerable personal import, "that I shall provide the Crown with a complete and unabbreviated account of the events as I understand them. The truth, as Inspector Cranston suggested, appears to be the only course that maintains any semblance of integrity. Moreover, I have concluded that I owe Mr. Hastings no protection whatsoever, for he has demonstrated far greater loyalty to a dead man than to the living one whose employ he occupied. And finally, I have determined that Charles's memory, already thoroughly compromised by his own actions, will not be further damaged by the revelation of his crimes. He murdered his brother to preserve his reputation and his comfort. The least I can do is ensure that his crime does not escape examination and judgment, however delayed that judgment may prove." Whimsy regarded her with an expression of genuine approval, tinged with that particular irony that attended any moment in which human beings manage to act with something approaching moral consistency. "A commendable resolution, Mrs. Ashford, one that will undoubtedly complicate matters considerably for the Crown, and potentially prove rather unfavorable for Mr. Hastings, but one that possesses the considerable virtue of being rooted in truth rather than convenience. I confess I am rather impressed by your willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for abstract principle. Many individuals of your station would have chosen differently. Many individuals of my station have never been married to a murderer," Margaret replied with considerable asperity. "I suspect my perspective may be somewhat altered by that particular circumstance, but I confess I am curious regarding one matter, Lord Peter. How precisely did you arrive at your deductions regarding Charles's involvement in Edward's death? The evidence, while now apparent, was not obviously presented to you upon your arrival." Whimsy set down his glass with deliberate care, and his expression assumed that particular quality of professorial satisfaction it acquired when he was about to explain the logical architecture that others had failed to observe. The matter began, as these matters frequently do, with an apparent trifle. The cushion was positioned with excessive precision, not the casual arrangement one observes in ordinary domestic circumstances, but rather something suggesting it had been placed with meticulous attention to its exact location and orientation. That precision suggested not aesthetic consideration but rather functional purpose. Combined with the chemical odor that Margaret had detected, it became apparent that the cushion was not merely a cushion but rather a delivery mechanism for some substance intended to produce a specific physiological result. He paused to allow this observation to settle. Simultaneously, the matter of the violet scarf presented itself as curiously anomalous. Why would a man of Charles's temperament wear such a garment for a private afternoon in his morning room? The answer became apparent only when one considered what the scarf might be concealing, namely, physical evidence of considerable vintage. A man does not wear a concealing garment around his neck unless he has reason to believe that something about his neck might provoke observation or suspicion. The combination of these two observations suggested that Charles possessed a secret of considerable delicacy, one that he had expended considerable effort to conceal. The telegram from Cairo provided the mechanism through which that secret became relevant. But how could you possibly have known about Edward's death before receiving the telegram? Margaret pressed. You could not have, yet you directed your inquiries with such precision that it became clear you suspected something quite specific. Elementary deduction from available evidence, Whimsy explained. You mentioned quite casually that Charles had inherited a considerable sum 5 years ago. You further mentioned that he had subsequently retained Hastings, a man who had previously served another employer. Why would a man of Charles's calculated nature retain a servant who had served another master, unless that retention served a specific purpose? The most obvious purpose would be insurance against exposure, the retention of someone who possessed dangerous knowledge. Combined with your observation that Charles never spoke of his brother, the picture became considerably clearer. People do not systematically avoid mentioning family members unless those family members represent something threatening to their present circumstances. The conclusion that Edward had died under suspicious circumstances and that Charles harbored guilty knowledge regarding those circumstances followed logically from these observations. Margaret nodded slowly, as though fitting together the final pieces of a puzzle that had occupied her consciousness for considerably longer than the present afternoon. So, from the moment you arrived, you were essentially reconstructing the crime backwards, from Charles's present behavior to Edward's past death. Precisely, Whimsy confirmed, which is why the arrival of the telegram proved so gratifying from an investigative standpoint. It confirmed what the evidence had already suggested, namely that Edward's death had not been the accident it purported to be, and that someone had possessed both motive and opportunity to contrive Charles's demise. The only remaining question was whether that someone possessed the technical knowledge to construct such an elaborate mechanism. Hastings's confession answered that query with considerable thoroughness. Edward, you see, had anticipated his own murder with remarkable prescience. He had ensured that his revenge would reach backward across time itself, that his brother would be destroyed not by immediate violence, but by the gradual corrosion of fear and paranoia. In a sense, Charles murdered himself. Hastings merely provided the mechanism through which that suicide became possible. The evening deepened into something approaching midnight, and Whimsy showed no inclination to depart Ashford Manor, settling instead into the library with the air of a man whose investigation, while formally concluded, possessed certain philosophical dimensions that demanded further contemplation. He had requested certain documents from Charles's study, financial ledgers, correspondence, and various other materials that Margaret willingly provided, having concluded that any remaining secrets pertaining to her late husband might as well be exhausted in the presence of someone equipped to interpret them. As he perused these documents, cross-referencing dates and figures with the precision of an accountant, a rather remarkable pattern began to emerge from what had initially appeared to be merely the financial chaos of a man engaged in systematic embezzlement. This is quite fascinating, Whimsy observed, holding aloft a particular ledger bearing the Ashford business insignia. Your husband did not merely embezzle funds, Mrs. Ashford. He embezzled them in a manner that suggests considerable sophistication regarding concealment. He created phantom shipments, false invoices, and entirely fictitious clients, all arranged with such care that the fraud might have persisted indefinitely had Edward not possessed the particular combination of business acumen and suspicious temperament necessary to uncover it. What is more remarkable, however, is that Charles apparently continued this pattern of behavior for some considerable time after Edward's death. The embezzlement did not cease upon his brother's demise. It merely transformed itself into something considerably more refined. Margaret leaned forward with evident interest, her expression suggesting that the revelation of additional criminality now possessed a kind of abstract fascination divorced from any personal consequence. "What do you mean, transformed itself?" she inquired. "I mean," Whimsy explained, that having committed murder to preserve his embezzlement, Charles did not cease his criminal activities, but rather redirected them toward different purposes. The funds he embezzled subsequent to Edward's death were not retained for personal use in any obvious manner. Rather, they were dispersed to various legal firms and certain private investigators engaged in Cairo. He was, in essence, paying for silence. He was ensuring that any investigation into Edward's death would be forestalled, corrupted, or deliberately mishandled. He was purchasing the continued ignorance of the Cairo authorities regarding his own presence in that city at the moment of his brother's demise. Whimsy set down the ledger and regarded Margaret with an expression of profound weariness. "Your husband was not merely a murderer, Mrs. Ashford. He was a man who murdered once and then spent 5 years engaged in the meticulous process of murdering his own conscience. He paid for silence, yes, but more significantly, he paid to ensure that he himself would never be forced to confront the full implications of his own actions. He surrounded himself with servants and associates who possessed dangerous knowledge, and he maintained them in his employment through a combination of financial remuneration and implicit threat. He created, in essence, a prison of his own making, one in which he was simultaneously jailer and prisoner." A knock at the library door interrupted this philosophical discourse. A servant appeared bearing a telegram on a silver salver, this one bearing the official seals of the Old Bailey, suggesting that the legal machinery had begun its inexorable process of transformation of these events into formal charges and trial proceedings. Whimsy opened it with the casualness of a man accustomed to receiving communications at irregular hours, though his expression underwent a subtle alteration as he absorbed its contents. He read it twice, carefully, before handing it to Margaret with the observation that she would find its contents considerably more encouraging than one might have anticipated. The telegram informed them that certain new evidence had come to light regarding Edward Ashford's death in Cairo. Specifically, the Cairo Constabulary had located an individual who had witnessed Charles Ashford's departure from the hotel on the evening in question, an individual whose testimony, combined with the letter Edward had composed and the financial documentation now available to investigators, provided what the authorities described as compelling evidence regarding Mr. Charles Ashford's culpability in the death of his brother. Furthermore, the Cairo authorities had formally requested extradition of Charles Ashford to face charges of murder. The telegram concluded with a note indicating that while this request could not be fulfilled due to Charles's demise, the British Crown would be interested in any evidence that might illuminate the circumstances of his death. Given that those circumstances appeared to have been influenced by his knowledge that his crime was finally being investigated, this complicates matters considerably, Whimsy observed, returning to his seat with the air of a man who had just received confirmation of theories he had harbored, but could not previously substantiate. The Crown will now be obliged to present to a jury not merely a case of Hastings murdering Charles, but rather a case in which the victim himself was guilty of murder. They will be obliged to establish, in precise detail, the nature and extent of Charles's crime in Cairo. And they will be obliged to explain, to a jury composed of ordinary citizens attempting to comprehend extraordinary circumstances, precisely how a man dead 5 years was able to engineer the death of his brother in the present day. Margaret had gone quite still, her expression suggesting that she was confronting the full complexity of the legal machinery that would now engage with her husband's crimes and the circumstances attending them. "Will this evidence regarding Edward's murder prove advantageous to Hastings?" she asked quietly. "Advantageous is perhaps too strong a term," Whimsy replied. "However, it will provide his barrister with considerable material to present to a jury regarding the moral complexities of the situation. A jury confronted with the full scope of Charles's crimes, murder, embezzlement, corruption of foreign authorities, may prove considerably more sympathetic to the argument that Hastings' actions, while technically criminal, were motivated by justice rather than malice. Whether a jury will permit that sympathy to overcome their legal obligations remains, of course, an open question. But the presence of this new evidence has transformed what appeared to be a straightforward case of premeditated murder into something considerably more philosophically ambiguous. The trial of Mr. James Hastings commenced on a grey morning in February, some 3 months after the events that had transpired at Ashford Manor, and Whimsy attended the proceedings with the air of a man fulfilling an obligation he had undertaken to himself rather than to any external authority. The courtroom possessed that particular quality of aggressive institutional formality that English legal proceedings affect: high ceilings, dark wood, and an atmosphere suggesting that truth was something to be extracted through the meticulous application of procedure rather than discovered through simple observation. The Crown's case, presented by Sir Reginald Harker, a barrister of considerable reputation and equally considerable inflexibility, was precisely what one might have anticipated, a straightforward narrative of premeditated murder, supported by testimony regarding Hastings's access to the morning room, his knowledge of Charles Ashford's habits, and the physical evidence of the poisoned cushion. Sir Reginald conducted his examination with the precision of a man constructing an edifice he anticipated would require no modification or embellishment. The facts, as he presented them, spoke with sufficient clarity that any jury of reasonable persons would be obliged to render a verdict of guilty. Hastings's defense, however, proved considerably more elaborate and considerably more effective than the Crown appeared to have anticipated. His barrister, a younger man named Christopher Ashford, no relation to the deceased, though the coincidence of nomenclature provoked considerable courtroom amusement, had constructed a narrative that did not deny the facts of the Crown's case, but rather placed those facts within a context considerably more philosophically ambiguous than Sir Reginald's presentation had permitted. He called witnesses from Cairo who testified to Edward Ashford's death under suspicious circumstances. He presented financial documentation establishing Charles's systematic embezzlement and his subsequent corruption of the Cairo investigation. He introduced Edward's letter, read aloud to the jury by Inspector Cranston, in which Edward had explicitly articulated his intention to arrange posthumous vengeance should his brother escape prosecution. And finally, he called Margaret Ashford to the witness stand, where she presented a comprehensive and emotionally devastating account of her late husband's crimes, his paranoia, and his increasingly labor. 8 mechanisms of concealment. The impact of this testimony upon the jury was readily apparent, though it remained uncertain precisely how that impact would translate into their ultimate verdict. Whimsy observed from the gallery with the detached interest of a man whose professional curiosity had been satisfied but whose human curiosity regarding the mysteries of justice remained persistently engaged. When Christopher Ashford rose to deliver his closing argument, he did not attempt to argue his client's innocence. Rather, he constructed a philosophical meditation upon the nature of justice, revenge, and the peculiar obligations that bind individuals to those who have suffered wrongs. They are powerless to redress through conventional legal mechanisms. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the particular cadence of rhetorical persuasion, "you are asked to render a verdict of guilty or not guilty regarding the charge of murder brought against my client, Mr. James Hastings. I do not dispute the facts as presented by the Crown. Mr. Hastings did indeed place a substance within the cushion that led to Charles Ashford's death. Mr. Hastings did indeed possess knowledge of Mr. Ashford's habits and intentions. These facts are not in dispute. What is in dispute, however, is the moral and legal significance of those facts. My client was asked, by a dying man, a man subsequently murdered by the very individual whose death my client engineered, to ensure that justice, however delayed, would ultimately be administered. My client fulfilled that obligation. He did so not from malice or personal enmity, but rather from a sense of duty to a man who had treated him with considerable kindness, and who had been murdered by an individual who subsequently escaped prosecution through geographical distance and financial corruption. Should a man be condemned for ensuring that RDR does not escape retribution merely because that retribution arrives through unconventional channels? Sir Reginald's rebuttal proved considerably less philosophically ambitious, focusing instead upon the proposition that regardless of mitigating circumstances or moral ambiguities, the law of England required that murder be prosecuted and punished, that vigilantism could not be permitted to supersede the jurisdiction of proper courts, and that sentiment, however sympathetic, could not be allowed to override the clear and unambiguous language of English criminal statute. His argument was legally sound, procedurally unassailable, and emotionally sterile, precisely the sort of argument that a jury composed of reasonable persons might be expected to find simultaneously persuasive and profoundly unsatisfying. The jury withdrew to deliberate at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, and they returned to the courtroom approximately 7 hours later, having apparently engaged in considerable discussion regarding the proper balance between legal obligation and moral consideration. When asked whether they found the defendant guilty or not guilty of the charge of murder, the foreman rose slowly, his expression suggesting that the jury had reached a verdict only after considerable internal conflict. "Not guilty," he pronounced, and the courtroom erupted into a chaos of reaction that the presiding judge required several minutes to restore to order. Wimsey observed this verdict with an expression of philosophical resignation, as though he had anticipated it, and found it simultaneously satisfying and troubling. As Hastings was released from custody, and Margaret Ashford collapsed into tears of apparent relief, Wimsey gathered his coat and departed the courtroom without awaiting the various legal formalities that necessarily attended the conclusion of such proceedings. Inspector C.R. Anston, observing his departure, followed him into the corridor with the observation that the verdict appeared to have provoked in Wimsey a response considerably less celebratory than one might have anticipated. "I am not celebrating," Wimsey replied, pausing at the top of the courtroom steps. "I am merely observing that justice, when it finally arrives, frequently proves to be something considerably more complicated than either those who seek it or those who administer it had anticipated. A man is free, yes, but a man is also condemned to live with the knowledge that he murdered another human being, however morally justified that murder may have been. That is not, I suspect, a particularly comfortable form of freedom." Lord Peter Wimsey departed the Old Bailey into a London afternoon that had acquired the particular quality of early spring, not quite warm, but possessed of a certain tentative promise that winter's worst depredations had finally exhausted themselves. He walked without particular destination, allowing his feet to carry him through streets whose architecture and history suggested considerably more permanence than the human dramas that unfolded within their confines. Eventually, he found himself at the British Museum, where he settled into a reading room and attempted, with conspicuous lack of success, to occupy himself with an edition of Dante's Inferno, a text that seemed to possess a certain resonance with the events he had recently witnessed, though whether that resonance represented genuine literary insight or merely the tendency of one's mind to impose meaning upon random coincidence remained uncertain. It was there, some 3 hours later, that Margaret Ashford found him, having apparently obtained his location through the somewhat circuitous method of consulting with Inspector Cranston, who had consulted with his various constables, who had consult. Ed, with the porter at Wimsey's club, she appeared considerably diminished from the woman who had confronted him in the morning room of Ashford Manor some months previous, diminished not in physical presence, but rather in the particular quality of certainty that had attended her during the investigation and trial. She settled herself across from him with the hesitation of one approaching a shrine of considerable spiritual significance, and when she spoke, her voice carried that quality of fractured composure one observes in individuals who have expended their emotional reserves and now operated upon fumes alone. "I wish to thank you," she said simply, "for all that you accomplished, for the manner in which you approached the matter. Mr. Hastings has departed England. He departed yesterday, apparently to Cairo, where he intends to establish himself in some capacity related to business or trade. The solicitors have arranged his affairs with considerable discretion. I have inherited the Ashford fortune, which is considerably larger than I had anticipated, given that Charles's embezzlement apparently terminated at some point in the preceding decade. And I have decided to sell the manor house. I cannot remain in a place where so much ugliness has crystallized itself into physical form." Wimsey closed his volume of Dante with deliberate care and regarded her with an expression combining genuine sympathy with that particular philosophical detachment that characterized his engagement with human suffering. "Mrs. Ashford," he began, "you have done what few individuals in your position would have possessed the moral courage to do. You have ensured that truth, however uncomfortable, has been permitted to supersede convenience. You have permitted your late husband's crimes to be examined and judged, despite the personal cost that examination and judgment necessarily imposed upon you. You have acted with integrity in circumstances that would have provided ample justification for considerably less scrupulous behavior. I commend you upon these actions, though I suspect you derive considerably less satisfaction from them than one might anticipate." "I derive no satisfaction at all," Margaret replied quietly. "I derive only a peculiar form of exhaustion, the exhaustion of having confronted truths one would infinitely have preferred to remain concealed. I am curious regarding one matter, however, Lord Peter. When you departed Cairo some months ago, you did not pursue any investigation regarding Edward's death itself. You did not contact the authorities there, nor did you conduct any independent inquiry. Why? Surely the murder of Edward Ashford deserved investigation, rather than merely the murder of Charles." Wimsey was quiet for a considerable time, and when at last he responded, his voice had acquired that quality of profound weariness it assumed when confronted with the limitations of human justice and the peculiar arbitrariness with which that justice was administered. "Because," he said slowly, "Edward Ashford was murdered some 5 years ago in a foreign jurisdiction by an individual now deceased. Any investigation I might have conducted would have served no practical purpose beyond satisfying my own intellectual curiosity. The Cairo authorities had demonstrated, through their corruption and incompetence, that they were disinclined to pursue the matter with any genuine vigor. And Edward himself, through the mechanism of his letter and his careful planning, had already ensured that his death would ultimately receive attention, albeit indirect attention, and only as a byproduct of investigating his brother's subsequent demise. I am not, Mrs. Ashford, in the business of pursuing justice for its own sake. I am merely in the business of ensuring that, when a person is murdered in England, that murder receives appropriate investigation, and that the murderer, if apprehended, stands before a court of law. Edward's murder occurred in Cairo. Charles's murder, however elaborate its mechanisms, occurred in England. That distinction, while perhaps morally irrelevant, is legally significant." Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing this explanation with the air of someone who had expected it and found neither comfort nor satisfaction in its articulation. She rose to depart, but paused at the reading-room threshold to deliver one final observation. "I have wondered," she said, "whether Edward would have been satisfied with the outcome. His brother is dead, his crimes exposed, his ill-gotten gains distributed to the crown and to his victims. Yet his murderer is free, and I remain imprisoned within the consequences of Charles's actions. Justice appears to have proven rather inefficient in distributing its rewards and punishments equitably." "Justice," Wimsey replied, returning his attention to his Dante, "is not in the business of equitable distribution. It is merely in the business of attempting to impose order upon chaos, meaning upon randomness, and consequence upon action. That it frequently fails in these endeavors is perhaps the only honest observation one might make regarding the human systems we have constructed to administer it. You are not imprisoned, Mrs. Ashford. You are merely confronted with the knowledge that the world contains considerably more ugliness than you had previously permitted yourself to acknowledge. That is not imprisonment. That is simply adulthood, rendered somewhat more difficult by circumstance and considerably less palatable by truth." As Margaret departed, Wimsey settled more deeply into his chair and returned to the particular circles of Dante's Inferno, where sinners endured perpetual punishment. T.S. appropriate to their crimes. He wondered, not for the first time, whether Edward Ashford had achieved something approximating his intentions, whether the mechanism of delayed vengeance had ultimately satisfied the demands of justice, or whether it had merely transformed one crime into two, one death into two, and multiplied the sum total of human suffering without reducing it by even the smallest increment. Outside the museum windows, London pursued its ordinary business, indifferent to these philosophical considerations, and Wimsey sat alone with his medieval Italian verse and his deeply unsatisfactory conclusion that sometimes, when murder begets murder and lies beget lies, the only available verdict is that everyone has lost something irreplaceable, and no courtroom verdict can restore it.